Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss. As you may know if you attended my live event earlier this month, I'm currently starting a new project of annotating and updating Rimsky-Korsakov's Principles of Orchestration, chapters of which will be released in a kind of open book format over on Patreon. But I thought it might be fun to kick things off with a bang by jumping to the very end of the book and taking a look at his appendix of Tutti chords, all of which have been taken from various operas by the author. In this video, let's focus on the first 7 chords in Table 1, starting with this massive C major chord from one of his lesser-known operas, May Night. The context of this chord helps to explain a lot about its character. It comes at the end of a slowly building scene in the opera, in which the sun gradually rises on the hero Levko. The plot isn't important, but now we know why the chord is so radiant. You may remember in my previous Tutti chord videos, I made the observation that the least important pitch in a towering orchestral chord is usually the dominant. In this case, the pitch of G in a C major chord. This is because the tonic supplies part of that sense of pitch in its overtones. That leaves the root and the third as more important. But if one really does leave out a lot of dominant pitches all the way across the landscape, then the chord becomes ever more glowing and bright. This is undoubtedly why Rimsky-Korsakov chose that strategy here. The only instruments supplying that G are second trombone doubling the lower pitch of tremolo double-stop violas, below middle C, and the lower horns teaming up on a full-bodied unison an octave above. Every other instrument plays a C or an E. Notice the orderly distribution of C thirds up and down the range of the orchestra. Flutes above the treble staff. Oboes, clarinets, and trumpets teaming up an octave below. And then horns and tremolo violins yet another octave below that, with the first trombone doubling the top pitch of the double-stop violas, really hammering home that major third of E. Add tremolo lower strings, sharing a C octave with bassoons, with bass trombone and rolled timpani on the upper C, and you've got a simple, direct, yet dazzling chord. The next 4 chords come from the opera The Tsar's Bride. Let's listen to the first of these in context with the passage in the opera score. Notice how the activity in each instrument part naturally leads to its position in the final chord, as if Rimsky-Korsakov were thinking about that chord all along from the beginning of the animato tempo change, and shaping the music to fit its layout. Here you'll notice that there's no pussyfooting around the dominant, this time on the pitch of F sharp in this B major chord. That note blazes out quite emphatically, shared by first oboe, first clarinet, and first trumpet at the top of the treble staff. Then first bassoon and first trombone an octave lower. While not as prominent as the previous chord, the major third on D sharp is played by the second players of each of those same instruments. But the real star of this chord is the tonic B, played in a huge stack across the entire tremolo string section, doubled by lower heavy brass, rolled timpani, doubled horns, and trilling A2 flutes. Piccolo adds yet another octave on top. The prominence of both the tonic and the dominant is easily explained in context, as the fanfaring figures that lead up to this point play over the notes of a simple B major triad, so the top destination note of F sharp will still need to be underlined, and the whole mass of little fanfares will seek completion in an ultimate high B in strings, flutes, and horns. This is further emphasized by keeping the brass down one notch to fortissimo compared to the strings and winds at triple F, so that 6-octave B will really stand out. But, as we heard before, it's a different kind of radiance than the first chord, more blustering and full-bodied. Some of this has to do with the bassoons doubling the trombones rather than playing octaves below, forming the warm, somewhat coarse central pitches inside the enclosing B octaves on horn. This is what a lot of musicologists might identify as a typically Russian sound from this era. I would argue that the leaner bass octaves, with only bass trombone and tuba to double the lower strings, are also a part of that sound. The next two chords are extremely similar in scoring. In fact, they're the first and last chords of the same scene in the opera. And if you were to just write them out on a grandstaff, they'd all have the same pitches. So let's analyze them together and examine the differences as well as the similarities. The first question to ask is, if they're from the same scene, then why aren't they just scored the same? The answer, once again, lies in context. The first chord starts the scene with no musical functions preceding it, except for a little bit of setup in the previous scene. Then it's followed immediately by a recitative. Therefore, Rimsky Korsakov can score an idealized chord in which the pitches don't need to be placed in a certain way in order to connect with any ongoing line in any part. He can even throw in some bustling excitement in tremolo scales and contrary motion from the strings. The last chord, however, while very similar, has many pitches that are dependent on the previous motion of certain musical lines in different parts. Like the third flute, first and second horn, second trombone, and second violins approaching their final Gs, settling down a half step from A flat. Or the mighty A4 unison of both oboes and clarinets, thickening the melodic line of the tremolo violins, also a very Russian sound of that time, I'd argue, ending together on a hugely pungent-sounding E that requires no doubling from the first trumpet as in the previous chord. And then, of course, with the strings finishing up the passage in a more chorale-like style, with only a few little slashes of scales. It's more appropriate for them to add their weight harmonically at the end. Let's listen to those last few bars leading into the second chord. With all these massive major chords, you might get the notion that this opera is a comedy. But no, it's a tragedy, with a final act that ends in treachery, poisoning, murder, and madness. Rimsky Korsakov very helpfully gives his readers the final chord to study, a dark, bellowing D minor, with huge weight on the lower register of the orchestra. In fact, there are no pitches above middle D. One might well ask, after hearing my constant exasperation over composers scoring their flutes too low in a massive tutti, why Rimsky-Korsakov has his two flutes settle on that final low D. The rest of that score clears up this question immediately. The flutes are there because that note is at the end of a downward two-octave chromatic swoop by the winds and strings. Any significant contribution that the flutes might make to the color or strength of that line is pretty much exhausted by the second phrase, and yet they're still included all the way to the bitter end so the players can have the satisfaction of finishing together, even if their tone weight is minimal. But all that's really beside the point, which is that this chromatic swoop really nails in the final tragic point of the opera on the last chord, racing downward to an incredibly fat middle D shared by all the upper winds, both trumpets, first trombone, and first violins in a unison double stop. That would be an open D string and a fingered D on the G string, a quite ferocious sound at triple forte. Below that, an F third is shared by bassoons, first and second horn, second and third trombone, and the lower double stop pitches of second violins and violas, the upper pitches of which also share that heavy middle D. These are both very simple double stops for those instruments, by the way, with the violas playing a very comfortable sixth, and the second violins stopping the lower A on the G string under their open D strings. Then the rest of the chord is simply an octave D below that, with the third and fourth horns, rolled timpani and cellos on the upper D, and tuba plus double basses on the lower D. Notice that once again, Rimsky-Korsakov keeps his bassoons up in the chord voicing, and has a less intense bottom octave with low brass and lower strings. He's absolutely counting on the mathematical formulas that he shared earlier in the book, about how loud horns must be doubled in order to match the strength of a single heavy brass instrument. So here he needs the two horns to be as loud as a trombone, which is still a little dubious in their lower register at triple forte, but a wonderful dark and braying sound all the same. The weight really is on the pitches from F3 to D4, the 6/3 section of the chord sitting on top of those octaves. This next example, taken from the opera The Snow Maiden, is a lovely little close-packed C-flat major chord without any winds. The full score provides some useful context about the composer's intentions. The previous 11 bars are scored with soft strings playing little harmonized figures, with a single horn providing a bit of an anchor behind the soprano. So what we have in the example is a surprise harmonic shift, the brass joining in with the strings for a sudden burst of color and warmth. Notice the economy here. Double basses and cellos unison on that low C flat, not at octaves, doubled by a single bass trombone. Horns covering a simple major triad above, and harmonically transposing in sharps rather than flats, with trombones doubling on the root in the fifth, and second trumpet filling in the major third of E flat. This is a better way of scoring these instruments because the range is central, and it allows the trombones to focus on a perfect fifth, and the trumpets to tune their E-flat octave. Notice, though, that the doubled pitch in the horns of sounding E-flat helps to underline the major third very nicely. Second violins and violas double the third and fifth of that same triad, leaving the first trumpet and first violins to take the high E-flat.
Then below, the timpani rolls on the E-flat mediant, showing that mediant timpani strokes don't always need to be on minor thirds.
This focus on that pitch, in turn, supports the soprano's final note of the phrase. If you get a chance to study this opera further, don't miss that terrific bass clarinet solo that follows this passage, looping under and over the baritone part that it accompanies, with a soft pad of lower strings cushioning below.
Сей поры душа моя любви не знала, одни утехи лишь известны были ей, а не страдания. А сердце гордое приказывать привыкло, не плакало оно, молить о сострадании не умело. Сломился я теперь...
But for now, let's turn to the last chord in Table 1. From Rimsky-Korsakov's most ethereal, complexly textured masterpiece, The Legend of the Invisible City of Kitezh. That's an E7 flat 5 chord, in a very open voicing compared to the composer's usual strategy. There's a kind of dense ferocity to the sound, with once again a combination of just strings and brass,
plus a little contrabassoon.
But no timpani this time. There's no need to put this into context with the score, as the pitches have been assigned for the most part without any dependence on an ongoing line of music except for the octave G sharps. What fascinates me as an orchestrator is the triple layer effect, with 3 separate groups overlaying each other on all the pitches of this anxious harmony. Tremolo strings, with most pitches played on the middle strings of each instrument. Heavy brass, with Rimsky-Korsakov's alto trumpet in F, sounding down a perfect fifth from written pitches. And most colorful of all, snarly stopped horns on the upper four pitches with contrabassoon on their bass E below. The contra is undoubtedly chosen because of its ruddier tone and better blending with tuba, rather than supplying one or two standard bassoons. One more touch worth noting in the full score. The heavy brass drop out at the very start of the second bar, leaving the diminuendo to the horns, contra, and strings. This kind of full bar tied to an eighth note scoring is sometimes used in jazz, film, and contemporary scoring to really get a completely filled bar without any note shaping causing a natural drop-off before the following beat. Not that this concern really matters that much, with a couple of bars of held chords going into a fermata, but it's interesting to see Rimsky Korsakov anticipating today's composers well ahead of their time. All that aside, the really important thing is that the dropout of the heavy brass removes a degree of strength that helps to underline the diminuendo, while simultaneously allowing the more complexly colored muted horns and tremolo strings to shape a much quicker decay under the fermata. The moment comes and goes in a flash, but like every bar of this opera, it's masterfully crafted. I've been planning to write an annotated version of Rimsky-Korsakov's Principles of Orchestration for decades, pretty much since the start of the Orchestration Online channel, and it's great to finally start on the project. Imagine his book with updated information about usable ranges of instruments, a 21st century orchestrator's perspective on his late 19th century approach, and in-depth orchestration analysis of his musical examples. Principles of Orchestration is a beautiful book, but in some ways it's quite disorganized without a comprehensive index or cross-referencing. My aim is to help keep this book relevant for future generations of orchestrators, while making it easier to access and study the wealth of information it provides. As I mentioned before, I'll be releasing chapters over on Patreon as a work in progress. The first section on string groups, Part A of Chapter 1, should be posted next month. As I go, I'll share some of the most interesting bits here on the channel, especially deep dives into scoring examples like these Tutti chords. See you soon.